So, welcome back to the Self-Actualization Made Simple podcast. I'm Aaron, one of your co-hosts, and
Cameron, your second co-host.
we're going to be diving into the topic today about authenticity. It's not just going to be about what authenticity is, but the common problems that we see from it and how to actually move through it. We're going to have a ton of client success stories. We're going to have a ton of practical exercises that you can glean from those stories if you want to apply it to your own journey. And we also share both of our perspectives and our own journey on how we operate with this principle of authenticity to actually make our life better and not to hinder it. Obviously, for those of you that don't know, Cameron has a very strong or had a very strong authenticity drive, right?
Mm.
I would say we all have a strong authenticity drive, but like we touched on last podcast, if you haven't watched it, go check it out. It's if he wants to use personality typings, we use it in a much more fluid way where you're not locked into the personality. It can just give some general kind of insights, like looking at the map, that kind of thing. Just give you like a rough map of how different personalities can show up. Obviously, I would say we all have an intrinsic drive to be unique, to be authentic. If you look at the stages model, there's a whole stage where you discover personality and you want to define yourself as other than everything else around you. But like we said last time, like whatever shows up in your personality in a typing is usually what you're more sensitive to. Doesn't mean that you're stronger at it. It doesn't mean that you're better at it. Although usually if you focus on these things, you will be better at it because you just focused on it more. So for those of you that know Cameron, he had a big achiever drive, but he also had a big authenticity drive, right? And obviously for the years I've seen him and he's worked on it and it's much not a problem at all, really, from what I can gather. But I was going to ask you, do you still work with a lot of people that have that drive and do you help them navigate it, or is it something that's separate?
That's a great question. What's
Mm,
interesting is as it's dropped away for me, I work with it less in my clients, right? It's almost, I don't know if
interesting.
you ever noticed that, but as
Yeah,
you've evolved, almost your clients and who you really resonates with you evolves too,
yeah,
right? So, but I can definitely notice, especially clients who maybe been for with me for a longer time. They've had that, especially at the beginning. And I definitely had to work through my own one to not
yeah,
project in any way, right?
yeah,
Because when you have something yourself, it's like it's more easy to judge, and then it kind of leads
yeah.
you to where you are
You're more
sensitive
likely to
to.
jump in and be like, that's actually not a problem.
Yeah, yeah,
You
exactly.
know,
But the fascinating thing about that journey of,
yeah,
being very sensitive to wanting to be authentic and wanting to have real identity is it's very interesting how it shows up as well.
mm,
Because, and maybe you've noticed this too, because you didn't really go for it in this way for authenticity, but with your own other kind of identifiers. But it shows up more concrete than subtle, then it gets more and more subtle,
yeah.
right? So,
So if we were to use because
yeah,
maybe
go
this
on.
might be a little bit for those people that are tuning in, for us breaking down authenticity, all that kind of stuff. Obviously, we know, and people who've gone through the developmental stuff, what concrete and subtle is. Maybe what might be better is if you can think back to a client which you've had where you've helped facilitate this journey. You don't have to say their name or anything, but just kind of like, so we actually have like a real concrete, practical example. So it
Yeah,
makes it a bit more relatable for people if you can do that. Let's
yeah,
call
of
like the
course.
client, like, I don't know, like Jim or something.
Yeah, Jim. We'll
I
talk
haven't
about
met,
Jim.
yeah, I haven't met Jim. I haven't heard the name Jim since Jimmy Savile, but we're not going to get into that. So
That's
Jim,
Jim.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Anyway, so I suppose when Jim came, we were working still within the entrepreneurship business owner
yeah,
type thing, and that was kind of the entry point. But one of the things they were really dealing with is they had this real desire to be authentic and special, right? which
How was
is
that in a
a wonderful
concrete
thing.
way? Out of interest.
So in this way that it actually showed up is in their language. They would just genuinely say like
Interesting.
wanting to be authentic. They wouldn't say
Okay, yeah.
special. I added
Okay,
that
yeah.
word, right? But wanting to be authentic,
Yeah.
right? And so, and they were getting into that journey of moving from 3.5 to more 4.0, which is in the stages model. And what was happening is within 4.0 as well, there could be a tendency to be called to more authenticity anyway. It's a bit of a word within people who tend to be at that stage. And it was showing up for Jim.
Mm,
And so what was happening to begin with was the business didn't seem authentic anymore, right? And they kept
interesting.
getting in the struggle of wanting to move to something that's more authentic, right? Or what was more kind of right for them. And it became very feeling centric, right?
Mm,
Which is something I've definitely dealt with,
yeah.
but something they were experiencing too. And they were a little bit more, they gave signs of introverted feeler, right? If we look at MBTI, introverted
Yeah.
feeler is one of the ways we might interpret the world through. And it was just very interesting to see that way that they related to the business as, oh, this isn't authentic, I don't feel good. And as we explored, this had been a little bit of a pattern
Mm,
where they'd kind of gone in something for 1 to 2 years, then next thing for 1 to 2 years, next thing for 1 to 2 years, and they felt like intuition was guiding them, and they were just leading with authenticity.
yeah.
But that was the words they were using, yet underneath there was almost this fear of getting stuck for them that showed up,
Interesting.
right?
Okay.
Every time the business would get to a point where it was a little bit like monotonous,
Mm,
right? It was actually doing really well, but it was a little bit monotonous. And
monotonous.
they were monotonous, that's right.
Yeah.
And they would just kind of have a real aversion to that. It would make them feel like they were trapped, make them feel like they weren't free.
Oh, that
And
is an
so they had,
absolute classic
yeah,
of thinking there's a problem.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then that showed up, and it's so interesting because we can kind of see that like that build up
Yeah.
of on the surface, I just want more authenticity. This isn't authentic. And then
Yeah.
as we explore, we just get down to that, oh, I'm actually feeling kind of constricted here and not free.
So
And
what was
then
their
I'm,
breakthrough around this?
yeah. So for them, once we just worked with this stuckness, and it was very symbolic, right? And so we did an introject release because the stuckness was represented symbolically as this like gooey, gooey energy, right? And so we just gave that back to where it felt like it wanted to go back to. And then we just
Mm,
noticed what emerged in the space. And for them, it was this really like absolute freedom, right?
mm,
And it was freedom that went beyond this kind of relative business or not business, relaxed or not relaxed. And it was able to feel a real sense of freedom when they were doing boring tasks or tasks that they'd
wow.
related to as boring before.
Yeah.
And then what's interesting is because we had started with that authentic driver, which wasn't really, it was kind of like the wording, but it wasn't really anything
Yeah.
to do with
It
the
was like the
issue.
close of the problem, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You probably noticed that all the time. And it's just once the foundations collapsed, is we didn't even get any more of that. Oh, I don't want to do this because it's not authentic. It just
Yeah.
didn't, it couldn't even arise.
Yeah.
And instead, what arose was just this deep freedom, and it felt really comfortable for them to continue with the business, which was doing really well,
Yeah.
right? And there
Yeah.
was no need to change. I didn't tell them this; they just experienced that,
Yeah.
and they were able to have a freedom with it. So that was more concrete.
Yeah.
But then later, because they still had shades of the mind orientating towards authenticity,
Hmm.
right? If we were looking at Enneagram, they had shades of 4 that
Yeah.
would show up. but also shades of seven with a lot of the freedom,
Yeah.
right?
That's why
And
you can't take personality tests as, like,
yeah, yeah,
concrete,
they're
you
just
know?
really cool frameworks, but they're just not a
Yeah.
great way to get identified with,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. Yeah.
But the subtle version of it was much more that we were just finding this weird problem where they would find it very hard to take advice around their business from some of the mentors that they had, right?
Mhm.
And it was like, well, what's the reason for that? And they had this kind of tone of thought, which was around them almost being not being able to be helped by others
Oh,
and them being
okay.
slightly special that, oh, they don't understand me. They don't understand my business, my problem,
Yeah.
right? This may work for them, but it's not going to work for me.
Yeah.
And that was a much more subtle way,
Yeah.
right? Of them like feeling a sense of needing to be different or special or authentic,
Yeah.
but in a very subtle way. It wasn't something they were saying in the words of authentic, special, but just a pattern
It's something
that
that
was
they probably
stopping them
didn't
from, yeah, they
realize.
didn't even know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it stopped them kind of receiving really good advice and feedback and mentorship.
Yeah.
And so when we broke that, and what's interesting is it was actually more of a grief breakthrough, right? And so I remember that it was them coming back to a situation where they had felt slightly left or on their own. And then this kind of I'm special had almost emerged as a protective thing,
Mm.
right? If I'm going to be on my own, it's because I'm special and it's not because I was left,
Right. Yeah.
right?
It's better in
Yeah,
some
like it's
ways. Yeah.
better. Like
You
it's
can
amazing.
understand why why your
Yeah,
mind did that, right? Yeah.
yeah, like it's the mind's amazing. That's way better than just being like I was left
Yeah.
and hurt.
Can I
Oh,
just jump
I'm
in
just
on that?
special. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And then we'll get
sure.
back to the story, obviously. But for those listening, this is why it's really important to not treat the mind or the ego or however you want to label it as something that's really malicious. Because as you can see from this story that Cameron is sharing from his client, if we were to do that, then it would have so many projections, it would assume so much stuff, but just also on an interpersonal level, treating something or someone like the enemy or like something which is bad or is out to get you, it doesn't have a very collaborative frame, to put it mildly. What it has is a combative frame. If you have a combative frame with yourself, an aggressive frame with yourself, that's the one relationship that you have in your life which you can't get distance from by definition because it's
Yeah,
yourself. But if you come with compassion first and wanting to understand the other person's perspective, when we say other person, we mean this other aspect of ourselves, we can see very clearly that this conclusion was not just so we can stay the same and stay stuck, but it's actually because, well, the two options I'm seeing are either I was left or either I'm special. It's just from, his perspective, you can see that being special is a much more functional narrative to continue on this life with. So that's why it was chosen. So you never want to assume any kind of malicious or malintent
yeah,
because it just will mess up breakthroughs later. But continue on with the story, Cameron. What's
yeah.
coming up for you now?
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think as we explore this, I'll finish in a moment. As we
Yeah,
explore the rest of this podcast, there's so much richness there, especially around internal systems and moving into democracy over a dictatorship and
right.
how important that can be. But I'll just finish here. And so there was this real grief and sadness underneath. And we just explored what was as the sadness and a little bit of anger arose and just in waves. And we just explored what the core value underneath might be. And this is just a system of working with grief that I learned from Kim. And what emerged for this person was wholeness, right? A core
Mm,
value of wholeness. That's the words they used.
yeah.
And so when this person just let that emerge, what really happened was they experienced a bit of the sadness and the anger from the grief as it arose, but then this wave of wholeness came through.
Mm,
And then, we nurtured and grew that. And we come back to that original symptom of not being able to receive the mentorship. Well, that dropped away, but what was even more wonderful is they were able to be in those situations with this real wholeness, where they didn't experience a need to differentiate some specialty,
mm-hmm.
right? They didn't feel a need that they need to be so unique to make themselves stand out. And I remember we were speaking, one of the things that emerged from this wholeness, because it started very somatic, and then we started speaking to it, doing the light work, and just what's its perspective? How does it view the world? What's the lens of this wholeness?
Yeah.
And it started to share things like this, just this idea that there's no need to create specialty. It's innate. It's emerging moment to moment,
Mm,
right?
yeah.
It's the uniqueness of the wave that's also connected to the whole ocean. And that's how they were kind of relating to it, very symbolically at that time.
Mm,
And then that led to the breakthrough, you know, just not destroying the symptom, but
yeah.
leading the symptom to no longer exist.
So what's happening in their life now opposed to before, out of interest?
Yeah. Well, they really started to be able to just do the things the business needed.
Yeah.
And they were already doing pretty well, right? They had a pretty good mind for it, and they were doing well before we met.
Yeah.
But what was great is they were able to take some meaningful steps, both in the actual revenue of the business, but also in how they were doing it. So it was, not destroying them day to day, and they were able to have a lot more time. But they just kept speaking about having this, oh, it's like not that hard. So
Yeah.
making it so hard before. We were just pushing through. And because they made it so hard, they couldn't use what everyone else was using. They had to find their own unique system, which is cool in some ways, but they would have to spend hours and hours trying to get the same result that maybe they could have gotten 30 minutes to an hour.
Yeah.
And so they just started to really grow again, but in a way that, in their own words, they just felt was a lot easier,
Mm,
right? They could actually just do what their mentor said instead of,
yeah.
having to do their own unique system.
Oh
It
my
was
God.
completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
I'm sure I mean, we've never had that problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Well, we
cannot
had
relate.
that problem, but we have a friend. I'm not sure if I'll mention his name, but he's a taller, blonde Swedish person. So Cameron knows the person we're talking about. And he had a bit of that as well.
Yeah,
We'll call him like Steve or something. But
Steve.
we met him when he kind of came out of the other end of that, where he was still kind of
Mm,
there, but he was aware that he was actually going to his cognitive behavioral therapist, I think was the time, I think is what he said.
mm,
And he said his mind would just keep on um, leading her down or leading him down. I can't remember what gender the therapist was, but leading them down like these kind of winding, twisting paths. And it's precisely because that symptom was never exposed of
yeah,
I'm so special and I'm so unique that other people can't relate and can't help with me, basically.
yeah, yeah,
Which it's just funny how our mind catches us in different loops, you know. But
yeah,
the reason why, I guess the reason why people have tuned in to this podcast on authenticity is Probably because of, to put it diplomatically, the nonsense that comes around a lot in the authentic
Yeah.
shadow work, light worker, even hypnotherapist, all this kind of stuff that gets tossed
Mm.
around. And on one side, I think obviously I can understand why that's happening, right? Because I would argue before you kind of get into that kind of stuff stereotypically, so if we're looking at a developmental level, this would be when your mind gets exposed to kind of pluralist ideas, although it can happen much earlier at, say, an expert stage, when you
Yeah.
just kind of get into, and those people are always quite interesting characters to interact with. How you can tell the difference basically by somebody who's like really into pluralistic, sharing perspectives, seeing all perspectives as equal, versus the people that are maybe at a bit of an earlier stage and have been exposed to those ideas, but don't really have them like as in the structure of their ego. What that means is it's kind of just their value system rather than how they think. How you can tell the difference is the first one, or when I say the first one, the ones who just have it as their value system. So the people at a little bit of an earlier stage, they're much more concrete and absolutist about things.
Mm.
And they're much more judgmental as well. Whereas
Yeah.
the second half of people, by definition, are not very judgmental.
Yeah.
Like if you're at that stage truly, it's quite hard for you to actually have a judgment on anything, which is one
Yeah.
of the big
Yeah.
confusions, right? Which is
Yeah.
actually quite annoying when you're at that stage. But that's how you tell the difference. But because these two groups often get conflated, because you have one group which is actually more developed, but because it's hard for them to have an opinion or a strong judgment on anything, it's hard for them to keep that community clean, so to say, right?
Yeah.
And the other one, because they just got exposed, they speak with a lot more certainty. They are a lot more judgmental. A lot of their ideas kind of get mixed up. So it's this whole like cultural, you know, kind of tug of war between the two. But like this idea about authenticity being the highest value, as somebody who went through that stage, pretty hardcore, Cameron. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I did. And also, when you do that, when you get really into a strong back to practice, right? Which,
Ah,
if you don't know or haven't heard of it, it's a very strong love practice, which can be really wonderful, but it also has this absolute everything is love, which can make it slightly challenging when your main conundrum is kind of defining and adding meritocracy and
yeah,
positive hierarchy
yeah,
instead of everything being flat. And so that kind of flattens it out again as a
yeah.
value.
Because if everything's
Right?
love, then everything's the same, right? That's why it's a
Exactly.
flat
Exactly.
hierarchy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly. And so the authenticity conundrum of almost this story of there's some kind of hidden authentic self
yeah,
that we're just working to let out. And there's a lot of richness in there that I think people get attracted to, especially when you've come from maybe you were taking on ideas of what you should be from others, from family,
hmm,
from friends, from society. And now there's this opportunity to be more of who you are,
yeah,
right? Be your authentic self. And so there's a real richness there.
mm,
And that's why most people get into it as almost a slight reaction, a freedom from what came before. Yet we can almost lose freedom when that starts becoming our only lens, our only worldview.
right,
And it almost like what we were speaking about earlier, when it becomes the dictator,
yeah,
right? And it's so easy,
yeah,
right? We start with positive intentions, it's like emerging freedom, and then it becomes the dictator. Everything's about authenticity.
yeah,
And especially because as we're emerging into these stages, especially if we do it at a pluralist stage, right, a 4.0 stage,
hmm,
we still probably have a lot of third person perspective or even, second person perspective, sometimes dragging
Mhm.
behind. And so it can get really confusing
Yeah.
where some of the things that may be emerging organically, like
Mm.
this curiosity, a really positive curiosity of
Just get stifled
what's
by the
real in
dictator.
me and authentic in me. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then that beautiful idea that
Yeah.
is just quite, it's not a rigid idea, it's a curious idea,
Yeah.
and gets mixed with maybe the part of you that has possible tendency to be
Yeah.
like a dictator. And then it becomes the only, we must progress into more authenticity.
Yeah. Exactly.
And we create this new, I'm not there yet until I'm fully authentic.
Yeah.
And I'm bad if I'm not expressing fully authenticity. And fully authenticity must be some really
Some
intense
mystical,
emotional
perfect. Yeah.
experience. Yeah. And it's, and also the other one is just being like super vulnerable all the time
Ah, yeah.
to the
Everyone's
point
your
where you're,
therapist.
yeah, like everyone
Yeah.
becomes your therapist. Like, bro, it's not that fun to be around
Yeah.
someone who's just sharing and kind of dumping on you a little bit all the time.
Yeah. It's quite egocentric, actually, if you think about it that way. But because it's
Yeah.
disguised by this higher ideal as authenticity, and it might not even be like disguised intentionally, but it gets disguised one way or the
Yeah.
other. You have this false moral high ground that this is what
Mm.
should be happening. But then when somebody has an authentic impulse to tell you to get lost and go away, somehow they're bad, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So that's kind of, do you know what remind, do you know what you remind, who you remind me of? And what this story that you came up with just reminds me of? Actually, a client of mine who had this problem when we first started working together. What should we call him? Francis? We'll call him Francis. Jim and Francis.
We need some names before we
Yeah,
start these podcasts.
yeah, exactly. But Francis, and he was actually a big time or pretty big time fitness influencer. Actually, kind of mirrored our journey and the things that we learned about because his system is very simple, very comprehensive, but also very accepting. Like, even though he's kind of into the fitness niche, like the aesthetic fitness niche, it's really cool because he's always said to me, like, yeah, people can look like me, but they can look like them. It just depends on their goals, right? So, really healthy dude, doing well in his, had about like 20,000 followers, Instagram, and then about the same amount on YouTube, has his own business and business with his friends, all that kind of stuff. But originally, what he wanted to work on is because he was reading my content when I was still on Facebook. And he was like, "Wow, I really want to share like this." And obviously, we got deeper into it, and he had this authentic thing. Like, if I'm not fully authentic, then I must be doing something wrong. But what that authenticity driver was doing, because it was the dictator, is it was stifling all of his creativity. Because if
Got
you're
it.
having this massive absolutist principle which doesn't have any gray area. It's just authentic or not. And let's not even get into the fact that authenticity isn't even clearly defined. So you're defining it against this ethereal, abstract idea of authenticity, which when we actually sat down and we were like, so what does that actually mean? He wasn't able to answer the question, right? Not because there's anything special with him around that. It's just like that's how it is a lot of the time. And it was essentially this whole valley that emerged for him during, his kind of not formative years, but I think around teenage years. It was probably already a sensitivity, like we talked about in
Mm.
childhood, and then it kind of got bigger and bigger. And once we were able to work through that, it was a bit of an introject. So obviously a belief-based system that wasn't necessarily founded on too much wisdom, but it was also a part that was actually authentic, that really wanted this driver to be there, which is why when you're working with somebody or you're working by yourself, really when you're working with somebody, you need to have somebody who understands those definitions, like someone like Cameron. Because if we were just to view it in this kind of abstract field of just it's all shadow, then we could think that we have to let go of all of it or we have to integrate all of it. But what was happening for him, where it was more complex, why he'd gone to other coaches before and it never really got solved, is because He had an interjection, which was not necessarily even like this is when it gets so subtle, right? This is why you have to pick your mentors really well because it wasn't necessarily that the desire for authenticity was an interject, right? Like that's not an interject. Like that's just like a healthy
Yeah.
desire. But it
Yeah.
was almost his relationship to it and his meaning around it, the thing that's
Mm.
driving the authenticity, the thing that's formulating it. So that had to be let go of. But then he
Mm.
has now that's left over is this really healthy, authentic drive of authenticity, which has to be integrated. And literally since then, once that got resolved, this was like the first 3 months into us working together. We're still working together. After about a year, it's been about a year from there, just working on a bunch of other stuff. Uh, the issue around content hasn't even come up anymore. The issue around
Really?
sharing hasn't even come up. Like I've literally, until you mentioned it, I've forgotten that happened.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm I'm curious. A couple things arising. Number one, you mentioned there was this beautiful, you know, organic, authentic driver, and then the meaning
Mm,
around it kind of distorts it. Do you remember how the meaning showed up? Like what was
yeah.
happening there?
How you can think about it almost is we all know the color red, obviously if you're not colorblind, right? If you are, then this will probably be a bit unrelatable to you. But we can all point to the color red, especially when it's like a real safe red. Like it's not
Mm.
near to pink, it's not near to purple, it's just like in the middle, like right bang in the middle of that color wheel.
Yeah.
But you can almost think about it, the way we internalize red is different, right? So an
Yeah.
example of this will be me and Cameron actually had this like last time we were together. I have this shirt which I think is like a very slight green color, but Cameron was like, no, that's blue. We're seeing the same
Right.
color,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And neither of us are colorblind, at least what we know. We're seeing the same color, but it's the meaning behind it, which almost when the color's on the edge that tips it one way or the other for you to
Yeah.
say pink or red or crimson or
Mm.
whatever. So when it comes to this desire to be authentic, the meaning around it, which it wasn't even like the words around it, the meaning around it was this really harsh, hard, like
Mm.
filter almost.
Yeah.
And what it was actually around, now I'm remembering it, was kind of perfection. Like it's not
Mm.
just you're being authentic, but are you perfectly authentic?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the the structure was perfection, just the new word for it was authentic,
Yeah, exactly.
right? The new content.
Yeah, the content was authenticity. So the structure, exactly, the structure was perfection. The content was
Yeah.
authenticity. So an example of that would be like the ideal was this perfect authenticity, like Cameron mentioned before. Like, oh, I
Mm.
have to be like really feeling it, or has to just come out of me.
Yeah.
I can't keep it down. Like, it's just, I must be one of the muses from ancient Greece. Like that kind of
That's right.
perfection, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a tall order if you're trying to make daily content or weekly content, you know? And his content was already really good. Like it was engaging, and I don't even speak the language that he was speaking in, you know? So yeah, that was the structure behind it basically, which not only do I have to be authentic, but it has to maintain this perfect standard which I had like come up with, you know,
Yeah.
in in my life experience. But once that was let go of, it became much, much, much easier.
And I wonder what's the trajectory for him being like from that breakthrough to, more recently. What's been changing?
What's interesting actually is he was just able to do more, like you were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you start to realize that because it's no longer this constrictive dictatorial principle, like the breadth of what authentic action is just gets so much wider.
Yeah.
Like just doing a boring practice isn't any less authentic than doing something that's really engaging and artistic. It's almost like a lot of the immaturity of looking at that principle falls away and gets dropped. And it
Yeah.
enables you to actually have a much more wider scope of what you're able to do. So he was actually able to not just do more, but work for longer too,
Mm.
jump into
Yeah.
opportunities more, right? So
Yeah.
something which isn't even really necessarily linked can have all of these knock-on benefits, basically.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to get trapped in that, like, oh, but should I really do this? This doesn't feel authentic to me.
Yeah. Like this is authentic, this is not. I can't do this now.
Yeah,
You know?
exactly. Yeah.
Ah,
Should we just take a quick
classic.
break?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
just
sure thing.
So what's coming up for you? What is coming up for you right now?
Yeah. It reminds me of this principle that emerges so many times of top down versus bottom up,
Oh my God, yeah.
right? And just trying to do a top down um, view or trying to engage with it from top down just restricts it so much. Like in
Yeah.
this way, maybe when they become or were more top down at the beginning,
Yeah.
right, it was creating a lot of restriction. And
Hmm.
then when it just emerges as it wants to without trying to make it be a certain way, it's so different. I'm
Hmm.
curious if you want to speak on that, especially in this scenario with
Yeah.
the client.
Yeah, so the principle top down versus bottom up, first introduced to me by one of my mentors, Pierre. Almost always, if you have a very binary, absolutist response, it most likely is coming from something which is very top down. And the problem with something which is top down is it doesn't give any space for interpretation. Your perspective gets narrowed and it restricts this whole area which could be open to you, like the example that I just gave of Francis, where now he's able to do this whole range of work very easily. When you have an
Yeah,
absolutist principle, that range of work in this example just becomes very narrow and it
yeah,
stifles you, basically. Top down is almost always a stifling principle. Now, there's always exceptions, right? Like if you're in a tough situation and top down, like just work hard, that's actually very useful because if you're
yeah,
not working hard and top down forcing yourself into working hard is the only thing that's worked for you, that's great. But like with anything, at some point it needs to mature. And sometimes that will happen naturally, a lot of the time it won't. So when we're talking about authenticity as a top down principle, that becomes inherently restrictive, stifling, and something which just inherently makes you feel very limited. It's almost like putting on a straitjacket
yeah,
is what a top-down principle is. But whereas when we get rid of that top-down principle and we just trust that authenticity will naturally arise, which it will, you don't have to force it. You don't have to keep on
yeah,
saying it. You don't have to label everything you're doing as authentic. You don't have to say, like I
yeah,
recently just had um incident happen with me where there was this person like just putting all this judgment onto me, which I actually
mm,
shared with Cameron a few days ago. And that's coming from a very like top-down view on something, right? We're not going to get into the topic right now, but I would say there was actually a strong authenticity driver in that, like wanting to be heard, ideas about or being authentic. Oh, I'm just sharing this to be authentic. This, and this. It also, to add a second part of this, affects your relationship with others too, because it just
yeah,
makes you, it will kind of turn you off from people that might want that perspective sharing or fluidity of how you look at things. Not that there's no certainty and not that there's no structure. There's a ton of certainty, there's a ton of structure. But you typically, these people are a bit more mature as well, right? So you just kind of turn yourself off from making those connections
yeah,
as well. So there's a personal, like a subjective view of it, but there's also an objective view of it too. Obviously, doing more
yeah,
work is objective too, but what I mean is there's external as well going on. But when you trust that you don't have to force authenticity, it's just going to come up naturally. Obviously, if you've done your shadow work and you're on this path, then what you get is actually a much softer but a much stronger principle of whatever that is. Like you could say
Yeah.
even that the bhakti practice that Cameron was doing, the yoga of devotion, like everything is love. That's quite top down, actually, right?
Very top down.
Super top down. And it kind of just gets you one shade of loving everything.
Yeah.
But if, as soon as Cameron, at least from what I noticed in his vibe, as soon as he got rid of that top down principle and he just trusted that that love would be embodied from a bottom up, rising to meet the experience, his vibe
Yeah.
became much softer, much stronger. And also, he was already very good at socializing because of our training in it. But he became much like better to be like his socializing just went to the next level. Like being able to connect with people just went to the next level. It reminds me of this prayer that Sister Kama did to me one time before I went
Mm.
and I left from Gdansk and to go to meet Cameron and Pierre in Budapest, which we stayed in for about a year. I literally can't remember anything of this prayer. I was just obsessed with asking for her blessing for this journey because I thought I wasn't going to be let in for whatever reason. I just had like a weird, a weird paranoia around it. And I literally can't remember like this blessing that she gave me. But what I do remember is, may the road rise to meet you. And I thought that was super impactful. That's basically the bottom up principle, right?
Yeah.
Every experience that's coming towards you, right? The external and the internal. Your internal rises to meet it, and you can trust that
Yeah.
if you've done your shadow work, all that kind of good stuff. You're
Yeah.
not saying this is a path and I'm going to step and I'm going to take this step and I'm going to take this step. No, you just trust that you're going to walk down that path. And that as you keep on
Mm.
walking, that road is going to keep arising in front of you and you're going to keep rising to meet it.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
It
What's
gives
your
me such good
perspective on it?
memories of sister.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's so interesting. I notice when I'm in bottom up, just as a way, even as a strategy, like working with bottom up, like for example, with business.
Hmm.
If I come at it, it's going to be this and it's going to look this way.
Yeah.
Often I'm a lot more tense. Even when it comes to content, it's going to be like this. I'm going to make it like that. It's going to be perfect,
Yeah.
right? I'm going to do it to this client, towards this client. It becomes much more restricted. Sometimes it creates a confusion because I'm trying to be perfect.
Hmm.
Yet when I just let it emerge, let's work with content with some kind of structure and let's see what comes up each week as we grow and we learn more about this, more about communicating, more about the people that we're trying to help and support. And it just emerges with much more richness. And more often, I find it more effective. Even this podcast, I remember when we were speaking about doing it, there was part of me that really wanted to know what it's going to be.
Hmm.
Yet when we just let and see what unfolds, it takes the pressure off. The conversations tend to be more fluid and flow more, which tends
Mm.
to lead to it being more engaging and more interesting. That's what
Yeah.
I think. I don't know
Yeah.
what anyone else thinks.
Yeah.
And tends to lead to the intention, which is us sharing, us doing long form
Hmm.
content and connecting with um, people that will resonate with this type of work.
Yeah.
And so, even with the work hard thing, where we spoke about that a little bit at the start,
Yeah.
sometimes that's so important to be a bit top down when you're in
Yeah.
a situation that requires it. Yet, as you do get a little bit more security and stability, sometimes that top down principle can be a little bit stifling. I'm
Yeah.
just going to work hard. What am I going to do? Just work hard. Doing
Yeah.
what? just
Yeah.
work harder.
Yeah.
It's kind of confusing. You're worrying more about the hours you're doing than what you're actually doing,
Yeah.
right? And there are stages for this, and there's an air of complexity. But I notice with clients of mine, usually they've done that. They're at a stage where their business is solid, is stable, is doing well, and that top down, just work more is almost getting in the way now.
Mhm.
You know, and it becomes more of that democracy of their internal world, where there are parts who want a little bit more rest, and there are parts who want to work from purpose and meaning. And we get them all to emerge together in harmony.
Mm.
It's like a rising tide.
Yeah.
And you spoke about just with your own client, how they just had so much more energy to do work,
Yeah.
right? Probably not telling themselves, I need to do more,
Yeah.
but
Because
just
you're not
finding,
taking
oh,
that
actually, it's not.
energy to
Yeah,
dictate to yourself. That energy gets freed up.
yeah, yeah. And it just becomes easier because it's no longer as well. I mean, that's another top-down binary of work and play,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
I
But that
work
was a big thing that you
from,
worked through, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I work this time and I play this time. And it looks this very, separate way. And work is grind is something to really go through, and play is something else. But then
Did
I
you
would
ever
find,
work with a
well,
client that also had that problem?
wow, that's a great question. I think a couple had shades of that. It
What were
wasn't
those
necessarily
shades
the
like?
exact thing. I think what would emerge for them was they felt work had to be work. Work has to be
Mm.
hard, right?
Yeah.
And this is a little bit of a trope that can get misconstrued, right? Where it's like work shouldn't be hard. Almost people go the other way
Yeah.
of right. It's got to be. It's like this
That's the
binary of
other
it's either hard or
danger
it's not.
of
Yeah,
having a top-down principle because in some ways what happens because there's all this force and top-down pressure, people go, you're more likely to just go the complete opposite way. So
yeah,
then you have this whole other paradigm that you have to work through as well. So you're like, it almost feels like you're constantly um,
yeah,
elastic banding between them. Yeah.
yeah. You just create another top-down
Yeah.
layer
To
that's
help.
not flexible at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To combat the other one. Yeah, exactly.
Now it can't ever be hard and has to always feel amazing. And I
Yeah.
can't do
And the
any like
moment it doesn't, that's when I have to stop, you know?
right. But the moment it doesn't, it's not aligned and it's not the right thing for me, right?
Yeah.
But this person, it emerged more organically. So we're working a long time together, and we did a lot of light work. And they were just noticing because it was more of an issue we didn't necessarily work through, the one that broke via working with other things.
Mm.
And he was just telling me that suddenly he was getting all of these ideas, but he can work in this way. He can like, when he's talking to his team, instead of he has to do this kind of boring professional PowerPoint, right? Because he worked with a lot of salespeople, he would draw everything. And he just found this intense inspiration and desire where he just spent like 10 hours or something crazy like this, just
Mm.
creating this amazing system for his team, right?
Mm.
And when he was doing it, he found that it was way more effective.
Yeah.
But that was also really enjoyable. He
Yeah.
was telling me that it was not hard to do that. And, he was almost bummed the next day. He had a few more meetings. He was like, oh, I would have liked to spend more time, creating this
Yeah.
system, right?
Yeah.
And it ended up being more effective. It ended up actually clicking with a lot of the salespeople that were struggling a little bit. So he
Hmm.
almost got it in a new way, in a more symbolic way.
Yeah.
And but it was enjoyable. And before that, his mind, it's not that it didn't know about it, like that is a possibility.
Hmm.
It's just it was so focused on it has to be this way, but it wasn't able to access that. It
Yeah.
wasn't able to do something that was enjoyable and more in flow. It's still very effective. But
Mm,
that just emerged. That just emerged organically.
yeah.
And without aversion of work when it may be hard, but allowing it also to not be, to be fun sometimes, to be enjoyable sometimes. But I'm curious if anything arises for you when we're just speaking about this and sharing this.
Yeah, it's just funny what the binary or the random almost confines our mind puts different things in. Like it just sections different things
Yeah,
off. And if you
yeah,
never look at it, you will live within those confines for your whole life,
yeah,
basically, if you never look at them. So in this example, the very kind of almost arbitrary line between work and play, and
yeah,
also the arbitrary line between authentic and inauthentic, you
yeah,
know?
yeah,
When did inauthentic mean I feel bad when I'm doing this?
yeah,
You know, sometimes it's extremely authentic to feel bad. Like if I steal from Cameron and I have a functioning, compassionate compassion within me, like that is normal to feel bad about it. And then hopefully to not feel bad about it anymore, I would confess, right? But obviously that's a very on the nose example, but it's just it goes to show you that sometimes our mind gets hooked by ideas for whatever reason, and if we never examine them ever, then those ideas shape us in ways which are extremely, extremely profound, like in your
mm,
example with your this client that you just mentioned.
yeah,
Another way it can kind of show up is um, almost like what gets seen as strong versus not. So we talk about this a lot about in the first two podcasts, how this was much more my issue than Cameron's, and Cameron was more about either being seen, like having the perfect kind of facade, if that's a fair way to describe it, and obviously this whole authentic stuff. But it reminds me because there's a guy here in some way who's quite similar, who was quite similar to me. Obviously, we have our differences, who I've been working with for a few months now. And a lot of his breakthroughs are coming from the fact that we're realizing that, or he's realizing rather, that this whole notion of being perceived as strong and not somebody to mess with is just completely arbitrary. It's almost like before you get exposed to that, you feel like this is just the truth. This is concrete, right? If I do this, everyone's going to think I'm strong or something. Or if I do
mm,
this, everyone's going to think I'm weak. So an example for him is, I mean, he was able to open up to one of his friends, right? Actually, a friend I'm doing work with as well. And because of that work, he feels really safe to open up with this other friend. But other than that, there was not really anyone else that he could felt like he could be vulnerable with. And after doing some shadow work, giving him this whole like vulnerability system we worked on together, he was able to take the plunge and open up to his friends. And lo and behold, his friend was really appreciative and then started to open up to him. Because the reason why that's happening is because this friend already perceived, what should I call this guy? John, as extremely strong, right? But then when you add on this whole performance of trying to be strong, then it makes you a little bit unapproachable, more than a little bit, really. Maybe some would even say a little bit intimidating. So this guy had always wanted to open up to John, but felt like he couldn't because John was constantly trying to push this arbitrary picture of being strong whilst not trusting the bottom up process that he was already appearing like that to begin with, right?
yeah,
Like he already looked, that's how overcompensation looks. He already looked like that, trust me, and he already acted like that. But as soon as he was able to open up and put a bit of vulnerability in front of his person, suddenly now his friend feels much more safe, much more connected around him. And John is able to actually be much more of a leader too, because he led that
Yeah.
exchange. But it's a softer leader. But the reason I'm bringing this up with arbitrary boundaries is because it's completely arbitrary that he thought if he didn't do this, then he wouldn't be respected by other people. But from this
Yeah.
example that I just gave you, he was already respected. But because of this overcompensation, it led to him being almost put on this, like, putting like a barrier between him and his friends, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you never examine your ideas from another person's perspective, you'll always be caught in like this worldview that I have the truth. This is what's right. If I don't do this, then this is going
Mm.
to be this, this, and this.
Mm. Yeah. And I'm curious because you mentioned the leadership, which makes so much sense. I wonder how that's been showing up for him, even beyond that situation, since he's
Yeah,
been seeing this and had that change.
yeah, yeah. So this breakthrough was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Mm.
And there's actually another dynamic of this, which is emerging right now, which is the fact that due to this overcompensation or a little bit of overcompensation energy, he works in corporate finance, right? So there's a lot of, to put it nicely, pencil pushing rule makers there. They kind of have to justify their work to people, if that makes sense. So what that means is there's a
Right.
lot of arbitrary rules
Right.
that are going on. Now, John has absolutely zero problem with being like, this is complete bullshit. Now,
Right.
who does that remind you of, Cameron?
I know a couple of people that
Yeah.
I can see.
So obviously, I knew where this was coming from straight away. It's not that the impulse is bad, right? That's an extremely valuable impulse that most people don't have, that feel it in that strongly. But if you want to step into your leadership role, you have to be the guy where when people stand next to you, they don't think that you're strong, they feel that they are strong too.
Yeah.
That's how you make a change. Does another person feel more empowered around you? Do they
Yeah.
feel safe around you? Do they feel like
Mm.
you hold their themselves and their perspectives with compassion? Whereas for him, it was just being a bit of a loose cannon, just kind of saying things as they are. And people would say to him, like behind closed doors, wow, I really respect what you're doing. And yet there would be no support. And it's because if you have a top down principle of, I just got to be this guy, for him, it's not just about being strong. It's like a whole bunch of stuff, like being strong, independent, successful. It's like kind of all tied into one thing. But if there's a
Yeah.
top down principle rather than coming from a bottom up perspective of, I'm going to trust that that's just a part of who I am, rather
Yeah.
than making sure that I fit into this confines of this idea. Because if he was to come more bottom up, which is exactly what we talked about on this last call, in a slightly different way, it means that you're able to, okay, I have this impulse arising, but you do not become that impulse to just challenge.
Yeah.
You're not consumed by it. It's an impulse in this whole universe or ecosystem that is you. And from that, you're like, wow, there's this democracy, right? It's not a dictatorship, it's democracy. Okay, I had this impulse. It's very strong. And I actually feel like this is justified. But let's check in with the rest of my resources, with the rest of me, and say, okay, is this a battle that's worth fighting? Or do I stop this one? Do I just let this one slide so I can build up more social favor or political favor in this environment? That when a big thing comes around, I can get a whole coalition and we can challenge that together.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it's basically the new dynamic of this is once you no longer come from a top-down principle, you just get access to so many more choices, resources, and empowerment because you're no longer a slave to this ideal. and you can become much more just effective, not just in the workplace, but in general. This is a workplace example, obviously, but this applies to all areas of life.
Yeah, I think that's really, really powerful, especially just noticing how it's almost even worrying less about themselves and just this emerging leadership that includes others, isn't so focused on it. Am I strong or do I look this way?
Yeah,
I'm sure you've noticed yourself because you had some similarities in your
yeah,
journey.
yeah,
Probably a sense of when that drops away and it's just like, oh, almost a security in there.
that was there the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Then just supporting and empowering others becomes
yeah,
the intention, which even, almost expands that sense of real strength and grounded.
yeah,
Um, yeah,
groundedness.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so to bring it back to authenticity, it almost comes back to this thing that we talked about like a year ago now, or like 6 months ago, one of the two. I know it's a bit of a time difference between those two guesses, but around that kind of around that kind of time, that
Sometime
time
in the
zone.
past.
Yeah, sometime in the past. But it was this idea that was coming up for me and for you, which leads me to believe the conclusion that I'm about to make, which we were saying like it's impossible to never not be authentic.
Yeah, yeah,
Like even if you were to lie for your teeth, the reason you're doing that is because that's authentic to your character in that moment to lie.
yeah. That's just what's
So
emerging.
for me, like the idea of all being authentic hasn't even come up for me in the last 2 years, And people who are struggling with this, they might be like, oh, but do I lose my authenticity? No, you become more authentic
Yeah,
because you're no longer going through a filter. You are just allowing yourself to emerge to this moment.
yeah,
I'm interested to get
Uh,
your thoughts on that.
yeah. And I'm just noticing because I imagine there will be people who have that like sensitivity,
Yeah,
which is
totally fair.
natural and
Yeah,
totally fair. And it's like the things that being authentic as a trait that we must be, that you think it's getting you, the authenticity doesn't really need to be there for that to
no,
happen.
no,
And it depends on how the person's making meaning,
yeah,
right? There could be thousands of different reasons, but whether it's under the dynamic of being loved or being respected and all
being
these different
free.
things that make being free,
Yeah,
right? We become more free, more able to experience deeper love, right? When we're not even worried about authenticity.
right.
Like you said, it's just impossible not to be. It's absolute. What makes
Like, how
this
could you
version
not
of
be?
me, yeah, what
Yeah,
makes this version of me now that has done a little bit more shadow work, maybe has slightly less constraints,
yeah,
more authentic than the version of me a year ago that had a few more constraints or a few more
yeah.
shadows.
Can I
And what
challenge you on
makes,
this?
go on.
Because Cameron's being humble right now. Cameron is a lot more free and has a lot less constraints and has done a lot of
Yeah,
shadow work and a lot of meditation. Even with all of those thousands, if not tens of thousands of hours in total of doing all of that, he's no more authentic than he was when he was
yeah,
in the depths of that problem period that we've talked about before during COVID, I
yeah,
believe it was. He's no more authentic now than he was then.
yeah,
His experience of life is much deeper and much fuller, and the life he's built is much more complete. All of this stuff is massively helpful. But when we're talking about authenticity, right? Why is that more authentic? or not authentic. Like it's a moot point. Like that
Yeah.
is who Cameron was back then, you know?
Yeah.
Might have been trying to, and just like me, I mean, I don't want to use your examples, so I'll use me because I don't want to feel like I'm speaking out of turn. But like for me, like when I had all this anxiety and all that kind of stuff, like I'm no better of a person now than I was back then. I'm no more authentic. I've much, if I was given the choice to be that person then or that this person now, I'd much rather choose now, obviously.
Yeah.
But authentic, like authenticity, is not like anything golden. It's just your experience of being
Yeah.
and sharing that, whatever's coming up.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah,
And, noticing it and you noticing it and our friends, you know, who've done thousands and thousands of hours of this type of work.
yeah,
You've done that. And yet, when we hold this, absolute authenticity, and even we can go beyond authenticity, just this absolute appreciation of the human that we are and the human that you are and
mm,
that people around us are. The wholeness, I think that's a better word, the wholeness in all of it. I think that just removes so much suffering,
yeah,
right? The version of Aaron 2 years ago or 4 years ago who, had less time in meditation and hadn't done all of his shadow work is not less whole,
no,
right? And you are now, and same with me, and same with all the people around us. And, it just reminds me of Terry because
yeah.
we've,
Terry
I don't,
O'Fallon?
yeah, Terry O'Fallon, yeah, I should say
Yeah,
names, not just the
yeah,
first name. But, as you get interested in stages, and I don't want to speak for anyone apart from me, but I definitely had a tendency to be like, oh, I want to be stage 7.0. That sounds cool. I'm going to run
yeah,
to get
wow,
there,
yeah,
right? You know, uh, I want to be the next stage, 5.0, 4.0, whatever it may be, right? I want to be this stage because it's better. But whenever you hear her speak, it's always just this dramatic wholeness
yeah,
of each version existing in a slightly different way,
yeah.
with a slightly different lens.
Slightly more perspective, but that
Yeah,
more
more
doesn't mean
perspective.
more whole, right?
Yeah, yeah. And in some ways, if you see someone, and for everyone who's watching this, we're talking about Terry Fallon's Stages Matrix, which runs
Yeah,
from about,
from Stages International,
yeah, 1.0 to, I think it's about, top one is 6.5. She's got written down.
something like that. Yeah,
Anyway,
that's where you are, right?
of course, I'm obviously at the top.
Cameron and Peak
um,
Bhakti stage before he had circumnavigated the developmental scale.
that's right. That's right. And so, even people who are at these really higher stages may not actually experience more wholeness than someone at a really healthy earlier stage.
Yeah,
That's been a huge breakthrough for me. I don't know if anything arises for you around this, but
yeah,
I've met people who are just so like fulfilled, right? And just they have a sense of wholeness and
yeah.
all their needs met, and they're at an earlier stage. And I've also met people at the later stages who maybe rushed there because it
And
meant
that's super
something more to them.
judgmental, super on
Yeah,
edge,
yeah,
all that kind of
and
stuff. Yeah,
they have they carried the shadow with them,
yeah.
and so the wholeness is there either way.
Do you know what really put that into perspective for me? So before this, we fell into the trap that most integralists really fall into. And when I say most, I mean pretty much everyone I've seen, apart from Kim Barter, 30 years psychotherapist who helped Terry O'Fallon, his sister, found Stages International, developmental psychologist, is when essentially you fall into this trap thinking that your partner or your friendships, they have to be like at a similar maturity level. And
Right.
then
Yeah,
Kim
yeah,
put that to bed pretty quickly when we were doing his year-long mentorship,
Yeah.
high ticket mentorship, which was the only thing that matters in a relationship. He was talking about romantic relationship, but I think this applies to all relationships. Is do you have intimacy, the ability to be intimate with them? Does this other person have integrity? As long as you have those
Yeah.
two principles, that's all that matters. And the reason why I bring this up now is because you brought up an example where there's a happily married 2.0 person and a 6.0 person because they love each other very much. So if that's the reality, then how could any stage not be whole?
Yeah.
You know, like we can talk about like, oh yeah, 4.0 is when you start to get less judgmental. I've met a ton of 4.0 people that are really judgmental,
Yeah.
and I've met a ton
That's
of
for sure.
people that are very conventional, sometimes even a little bit pre-conventional, which is
Yeah.
before rationality really gets going, where you feel like they're just super open to everything,
Yeah. Just really loving as well,
really loving
often.
too.
Like, they're way more embodied of what we think it should look like. But
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly. Yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it. I have
yeah.
to catch a flight, guys. Any questions, any topics that anyone wants us to bring up, just leave it in the comments below. I've linked to Cameron's channel in the description class below. If you want to get interested in shadow work, then I have my free shadow work guide. Download it. It's completely free, 3 hours, the most complete free shadow work guide. And shadow work guide, even for some paid shadow work guides, is the most complete that I've seen. So just download it. It will really help with all of that. Anything that you want to bring up, Cam?
This is something I should have prepared for, but I haven't. So
Yeah,
just, I'm going to be going more on YouTube, still have a strong Instagram. And yeah, if you feel like you resonate with any of what we've spoken about today,
yeah,
then feel free to reach out and I'd love to be in conversation.
yeah. So thanks for joining us. Enjoy.